made this teaching moment, and he turns around and he spits on the ground. And verse 6, he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, gross, okay? Then he spreads the mud over the blind man's eyes. Imagine the blind man, what you doing? Get away from me! You're putting mud on my face. And the disciples say, just relax, bro, see what happens, you know? They had learned enough to know, you know what? It's better it's weird, but let's go along with it. Let's see what happens. So he puts, you know, mud in his eyes. In verse 7, he told him, go, wash yourself in the pool of Siloam. So the man went, he was blind, and he went blind to the pool. Remember, at this point, he hasn't seen Jesus. He's only heard of him, but he hasn't seen him. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. He was healed. Can you imagine how excited this guy must have been? All of his life, people had made fun of him. All of his life, people had just ridiculed him. All of his life, he'd been a beggar. He'd been, you know, outcast, you know, horrible, blind, and all of a sudden he can see. The guy must have yelled, jumped, screamed, ran. I mean, it must have been an incredible reaction. It must have been the ooh and the ah of looking at everything for the first time and saying, so that's what it looks like. Oh, that's what it looks like. Look at, wow. I mean, I can't even begin to imagine what those few minutes were like for a person who's been blind all of their life to all of a sudden be able to see. This guy had been blind all of his life for this moment. Because God would glorify himself at this moment. And heal him. Now,
it actually starts with the cemetery and the gravestone and the 17-year-old with birth.
The wrong button, sorry. So, God heals him, and look what happens. Verse 8, now starts getting funny. Okay? His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, isn't that the man who used to sit and beg? Some said he was, and others said, nah, he just looks like him. What do you mean he just looks like him? Why would they even question that it was him? I'll tell you why they questioned it was him, because it was unexplainable. He was blind. Now he sees that there's no explanation for this. It must be somebody else. Because in their frame of mind, it didn't fit that something like that could happen. Because it was unexplainable, all of a sudden it's like, nah, it must be somebody else. And then you hear him, it's funny. He says, no, it's me, man, it's me. Look, the beggar kept saying, yeah, it's me. I'm the same one. It's not somebody else, it's me. Now they ask him a fair question, okay? They ask, who healed you? What happened? Everybody wanted to know what happened to this guy. And he tells them a story. He says, man, you're never going to believe it. He says, the man they called Jesus, verse 11, made mud and spread it over my eyes and told me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash yourself. So I went and washed, and now I can see.
Hallelujah.
I'm sure they're looking at him and saying, come on. Come on, tell me what really happened. Now, you got to have something better than that. Give me something a little more rational, you know? What do you mean you put blood on your eyes and now you can see? Come on, I thought you were my friend, you know, your neighbor. I've been nice to you. I gave you a lot of money when you were begging. Give me the scoop. Give me what really happened. And he's like, no, that's what happened. You know, there's this question there, okay? And then they ask him a really stupid question. Where is he now? He says, I don't know. It's not like I saw him, you know. I didn't see him. Where he went, I don't know. He sent me to the pool. I can see now. I don't know where he went. So don't ask me where he's at. So things are getting kind of confusing here. And then, verse 13, they took the man who had been blind to the Pharisees. Now, why would they do that? There's a really good reason why they took him to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were the ones that were responsible for figuring out who the Messiah was. It was their job, whenever the Messiah came, the Pharisees would be the one to say, that's him, and identify him. They knew the law, they knew the prophecies, they knew what needed to happen, so everybody relied on them. So they figured, hey, if this Jesus healed the blind man, he might be the Messiah. Let's take this guy to the Pharisees and tell him the story. So they bring him to the Pharisees, verse 14, but it was on Sabbath that Jesus had made the mud and healed him. Uh-oh, Jesus messed up there. He did it on a Saturday. See, he would have done it on a Monday, on a Sunday, on any other day. It would not have been a problem. But you see, on Saturdays, the law said that he couldn't work. And making mud is considered working. So, this is how technical they were about the law. So anyway, they bring him to the Pharisees. Verse 15, the Pharisee asked the man all about it. So he told them. The Pharisee says, hey, what happened? He says, hey man, Jesus put mud over my eyes, and when I washed it away, I could see. Now, the Pharisees aren't buying it either. They're saying something's going on here. Look what in verse 15. The Pharisees asked him to do that. Verse 16, some of the Pharisees said, this man Jesus is not from God. And how do I know that? Because he's working on the Sabbath. Think about how absurd this dialogue is getting now. No, Jesus can't be from God because he did this miracle on the Saturday. God would never do that. But here's where it becomes really relevant to us. The Pharisees had made a little box, and they had put God in this little box. And in their minds, there were things that God could do, things that God couldn't do. There was a time when God could heal. There was a time when God could not heal. They had this comfortable little box, and Jesus didn't fit in the box. So they automatically rejected him. Nobody that doesn't fit in this box that I created in my mind about what I think God is, no, nobody, if it doesn't fit there, it can't be. We have boxes. Every one of us has this little God box. Here's how God works, so here's how I'm going to pray. Or your box may be, here's how God ought to work, and since he doesn't work the way I like it, then I think there is no God. Or you may have your own little box and say, God may work this way for you, but he doesn't work that way for me, so I don't believe. We all have this little box. Maybe you were brought up in a home, or maybe you're listening to this and you were brought up in a home where it wasn't acceptable to believe in God or to believe in Jesus. If you're brought up in a Jewish home, believing in Jesus is not exactly acceptable. Because the box, there's no room for Jesus in the box. He's not the Messiah in the Jewish, religion. He is not God. He's just a prophet. So all of these things start factoring in, and the Pharisees had this little box. And you know what? They said it couldn't be Jesus because he did it on a Saturday. That was their response. And others said, but how could an ordinary sinner do such a miracle? That was undeniable. Other group of Pharisees says, listen, I understand, but no sinner can heal a blind man. So how do we explain that? If he's a sinner, how did he heal the blind man? In other words, this group of Pharisees would say, it's undeniable. We cannot deny that the guy was healed and that Jesus did it. So we have to find some kind of explanation for this. So they were really deeply divided. It says there was a deep division among them. Then they said, you know what? Maybe this guy is lying to us. Maybe he wasn't really healed. Maybe he wasn't blind. You know what? Let's call his parents. Verse 17. The Pharisees again questioned the man who had been blind and demanded, what's your opinion of the man who healed you? He says, well, I think he must be a prophet. They did not want to hear that. But here's what they were looking for. If he would admit that he thought Jesus was the Messiah, they would kick him out of the synagogue. And he would never be allowed back in it. So now they're trying to discredit him. And they're asking, what do you think he is? What do you think about him? He says, well, I think he might be a prophet. Okay, verse 18. The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see. So what did they do? Verse 18, they called his parents. Why couldn't they believe it? You were at the same point again. Why couldn't they believe it? They couldn't believe it because it was unreasonable. It didn't make sense. Blind people don't get healed. They're blind and they die blind. It just didn't make sense to them. That's why they didn't believe.